Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today a look at this gorgeous beast here, the Auris Audio Euterpe amplifier. Euterpe is the goddess of song and dance, and that gives a bit of a clue as to what the Auris Audio Euterpe amplifier is all about, and that is the enjoyment of listening to music. It does an amazing job, as I'll explain shortly, but there's a few wrinkles along the way as well. So come with me now as we explore the wonderful and beautiful Auris Audio Euterpe. The Euterpe retails for $1,700 US direct from Auris Audio, and over here in Australia, it's 2,700 Australian dollars. So it's not a cheaply priced amplifier, but at the same time, it's beautiful, it's well made, and it sounds spectacular, as I'll explain shortly. Before we get into sound though, let me talk a bit about the design. First and foremost, you can't help but notice these beautiful wooden side pieces that are also curved at the top to make the Euterpe a headphone stand in addition to an amplifier. I'm going to put the Euterpes aside for now while we talk more about the amp. So the Euterpe here, you've got these beautiful wooden side panels, and of course being natural timber, every single one of these amps is going to look a little bit different, and that's a fantastic thing in my opinion. It does mean there's a little bit of luck in the draw as to what yours particularly looks like, but I think it's hard to go wrong with a great wood grain. So in the case of mine, you've seen side 1. If I turn it around, you can see side 2, and both are beautiful in their own way. The craftsmanship that's gone into this is nothing short of wonderful, and you're going to be paying a little bit of that in the price, but unlike another reviewer whose review I loved on this amplifier, I'm not going to suggest that half of the value of the Euterpe goes into the wood design and the general look of it, but it is definitely beautifully made and beautifully finished. Inside these two wooden panels here is the amplifier itself in a vertical setup, which is quite unusual. Down the top, you've got 3 tubes sitting along the top there. So on either side, you've got a PL95, or you can use EL95 tubes. And in the center, you've got a 12AT7 tube. I'll talk about the tubes in just a moment, but it's a nice, simple setup and very clean to look at. Coming to the front of the unit, we've got the volume control, which is also the on switch. And so the on switch will then trigger a warm-up cycle that has this little light down here flashing. Once the light comes on, it tells you the amp's warmed up enough, and then away you go with your volume. I mean, you can turn it up beforehand, but no sound's going to come out. The volume control is a little bit interesting in that the actual output starts quite high up in the range. So at about 9 o'clock, you actually start to get sound, and you've got to be careful below 9 o'clock that you don't turn the amplifier off. There is a moment just before the click that it does actually switch off the amplifier, even if you didn't intend to. That has issues if you're using the internal DAC, which I'll talk about shortly, so it's something worth being aware of, but it's not a big deal. Channel balance is generally pretty good. It's not perfect at the bottom, but it's not too bad, and nothing I'm going to get hung up about. This is not an amplifier that you're going to be using with highly sensitive IEMs or really sensitive low impedance headphones, so it's probably not something you should be worrying too much about in terms of that very low level volume range. That said, as I'll talk about soon, there are some tricks I think it's worth applying to get a little bit more usable volume range out of the Euterpe if, like me, you don't tend to listen very loud. But before we get to that, let's continue on the front plate. Down below the little indicator light or next to, we've got the AD switch, which is for your analog input or your digital input, and I'll talk more about that when we get to the back. You've also got an impedance switch here for high and low output impedance. Now, I did some measurements on this. These are approximate measurements, but roughly speaking, the low output impedance is about a 35 ohm output impedance. So that's still pretty high in the scheme of things when many solid state amps these days have output impedances of 0.1 or 0.5 ohms. So a 35 ohm output impedance means that realistically this is not always going to be a great pairing with low impedance headphones. The rule of thumb is generally you want to keep the output impedance at around about 1/8 of your headphone impedance, meaning that if you've got, say, a 32 ohm headphone, you'd want the output impedance to be 4 ohms or lower. So in this case, we're starting at 35 ohms, and that means on some headphones, you are going to have some slight changes to your frequency response. In my experience listening to it, it has never done anything bad to any of the headphones I've tried, but it's something I do want to mention. When you switch to the high output impedance mode, that's a different story again. That suddenly launches the output impedance all the way up to 235 ohms. Now I should mention I've done these measurements with a regular voltmeter and a bit of mathematics, and I haven't used an oscilloscope which can manage a wider range of frequencies. So I did this testing at about, I think it was 125 Hertz was the signal I used to do this test, so there may be some variations in the exact figures. If anyone from Auris Audio or anyone else watching that's done more technical measurements of this, please share specific figures if you have them, but I believe the 35 and 235 ohm output levels that I've measured are fairly accurate. So that means for us, we've got a low impedance mode that is okay for lower impedance headphones, but is really better when you start getting up to, say, 80 ohms and above. And then when you start to get to the really high output impedance on this top switch, you're going to want to reserve that for things like 600 ohm, 300 ohm headphones. That's where you're going to want to peg this. Having said that, there's not any hard and fast rules here. Sometimes high output impedance modes, like the one on the Euterpe here, can do wonders for headphones that need a bit of extra body. I happen to really like the Euterpe in the high output impedance mode, driving the Focal Utopias. It helps to provide a bit of extra warmth and soul to them at the expense of just a little bit of detail and resolution, but it's a trade-off that I'm more than willing to make. The only place this isn't going to work well is if you try to put high output impedance mode with certain planar magnetics that are harder to drive. You're just not going to get enough power and you're likely to get a bunch of distortion. So stick with low impedance mode for planar magnetics and lower impedance dynamic drivers, and high output impedance for high impedance dynamic drivers only. That said, it's driven everything I've thrown at it with ease, and even though it's rated at 0.9 watts into 32 ohms, it's got buckets of power for any headphone in normal listening situations, at least any I've tried. So I'm not talking about putting it up next to a Susvara or an HE6 or something like that, but with the Utopias, the Empyreans, the HD560S, the HD800S when I had it, the Beyerdynamic DT880s, all of those the Euterpe has handled with no problems at all. Now I'm jumping around a bit as things are relevant, so let's continue on the front panel with one last thing, which is a 6.3mm output. So this is a single-ended amp only, there's no balanced here, and that's totally fine. There is no absolute need for balance drive. If it's a good single-ended headphone output, it's going to sound just great. So flipping around to the back now, we've got ourselves on the back a left and right input for your analog input, and also a left and right output, so you can use this as a preamp. I tried it briefly with my BeoLab 3 speakers, but unfortunately they're a bit of a funny setup and there was all sorts of ground loop noise. So I haven't been able to test that thoroughly. As you can see in the picture, I do have a set of studio monitors here now, but I don't yet have the right cabling for an RCA output into those particular studio monitors. I will get that soon, but for now I apologise that I haven't tried this specifically as a preamp for active monitors. What I can tell you though is based on the output from the headphones, it should do a wonderful job as a preamp. It'll bring a nice touch of liquidity and kind of magic to the mids that I'll describe in the headphone section shortly, and so I think it would be a great choice of preamp if you're looking for just a bit of extra magic. But there are some drawbacks I'll talk about with the headphone output discussion. Moving on here, we've got the digital input for the internal DAC. Now I might talk about this now because I'm not going to spend much time on it. The internal DAC is just an okay DAC. It uses a slightly older Saber chip, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. DAC chips have been at an amazing level for quite a long time now, so the fact that it's not using a current generation isn't the end of the world, but the overall implementation of it is just average. The sound's a bit flat and lacking in dynamics, and the difference you hear when you go from using the internal DAC to an external high quality DAC like say the Bifrost 2, the TT2, or the Burson Composer that I've got here, all of those really bring out a whole nother level of performance from the Euterpe amplifier. So I would look at this DAC as a convenience item only. It's there if you happen to need it, but don't think of this as an all-in-one DAC and amp. Think of it as an amplifier that has a backup DAC should you ever need it. Maybe it's something that you plug into your computer for YouTube listening, video editing like I do, where you're not looking for the absolute best quality sound. Because realistically, this amplifier deserves a much better DAC to get the most out of it, and when you pair it with a good DAC, you're in for some really special listening. While we're talking about the DAC, I do want to mention one other thing which I've already alluded to, and that is that when you switch the amp into analog mode, it actually turns off the DAC entirely. And that's a little bit of a problem because it means switching back and forth to compare an external DAC to the internal DAC is a bit fiddly. Your computer will lose sight of the internal DAC when you switch over to the external, and then it takes a bit of time to bring back the internal DAC into the system. So it's a little bit of a fiddle. For most people, it's not going to be an issue because you're either going to be listening to that internal DAC or you're not. You're unlikely in most cases to be flipping back and forth between the two of them. And as I've already said, I would just recommend forgetting that it has an internal DAC and sticking to your external high quality DAC. So now there's one final thing to talk about on the back of the amp here, and that's this little plug here, which is the power inputs. Oh shit. And that's this little socket here, which is the power input socket. And that's for this linear power supply that you see here. So the Euterpe comes with this linear power supply with this long snake cable attached, and the snake cable at the end of this nice long lead plugs into the socket there. So this provides you with a really high quality power source to feed the Euterpe and ensure high quality sound. It's a really nice addition to see this level of quality applied to an amplifier like this, and by having it in an external box, it keeps it from being inside the amp and making the amp too unwieldy on your desk. Putting this aside now, let's start talking about the sound. Enjoying this video? If you are and you'd like to help me make more videos like this one, there are lots of ways you can help, and most of them don't cost you a cent. You can help for free by liking this video, subscribing and ringing the bell, sharing this video on social media or your favourite audio forums, or by making your next purchases using any of the affiliate links in the description. Obviously that's not technically free, but you're not spending anything extra and it all helps out. Want to go a step further? You could buy some merchandise, t-shirt, hoodies, caps and the like, or you can join the Passion for Sound family on Patreon. It's a growing community with plenty of interesting discussion and your chance to influence what happens on the channel. Check out the description for more information and links where relevant. But for now, let's get back to the video. The sound quality from the Euterpe is nothing short of spectacular. It's a beautiful sounding amp that has a real magic to the sound that I don't think I've heard from any other amp I've tried so far. And the only word I can use to describe it is liquid, and I know that's not a particularly helpful term because it doesn't really convey what's going on. But I really just find the sound from the Euterpe just quite magical, and it's not something I can put into words. There's a quality to the mid-range that you don't often hear, and I don't fully know how to describe it. It's quite intangible what it's doing because it's not bringing thickness to the mids, it's not making everything richer or changing the overall frequency response. It's just the tonal characteristics or the timbral characteristics of the way it's delivering the sound. Where it's particularly special is if you're listening to strings or orchestral music, the Euterpe brings something to that mix that I just love. One of the first tracks that I happened to listen to when I got the Euterpe here was from a Vivaldi Four Seasons recording, and I've never heard the strings sound as good as they did from the Euterpe paired with the Mezza Imperians. It was an addictive sound that I just wanted to keep listening to more and more and more of. Admittedly, that magic is at its best when you're listening to orchestral music and stringed music, and it's not quite as obvious in more busy pop, blues, rock type music, but it still has a wonderful tonal characteristic no matter what you're listening to. It's just more pronounced on strings and most magical on strings. In terms of sound staging, it focuses the image really nicely, and whilst the soundstage isn't huge, there is still a very good sense of space between everything. Nothing sounds too congested, and everything is well defined within its space and beautifully focused in the image. So it's not one of those tube amps that creates this crazy big soundstage that's almost artificial sounding. It just does a normal soundstage very nicely. All in all, I can only describe the sound from the Euterpe as living up to its name, being the goddess of song and dancing. It's a headphone amp that absolutely puts you directly in touch with the beauty of the music, and not in a way of making it thick or euphonic or artificially colouring it, just delivering it with a wonderful sense of purity and truth and that liquidity that I mentioned before. The music just flows from the amplifier in a way that very few other amps do. Now in a moment I'll talk about the options for tube rolling and also a comparison with my wonderful Bottlehead mainline amplifier. But for now, I just want to talk briefly about some headphone pairings. As I mentioned before, the Euterpe does have the two different output modes, high and low impedance, and so I tried it across a range of headphones, both in terms of how its tonal characteristics favoured certain headphones, but also to see how I liked the output impedance with different headphones. The first pairing that I've already alluded to is with the Meza Empyreans, and it was absolutely a magical pairing. If you own Empyreans and you're looking for a headphone amp that gets an absolutely gorgeous tone out of them, the Euterpe should absolutely be on your list. As I said, it's not going to colour the sound, it's just going to bring a timbral characteristic to the sound that is a match made in heaven for the Empyreans. I've also already mentioned the Utopias over here behind me, and those work beautifully with the Euterpe as well. As I said before, I quite like them in high output impedance mode, but they're equally as good in low impedance mode as well. It's actually really nice that you can quickly flip between true to source with the low output impedance mode and adding a bit of extra soul and thickness to the sound with the high output impedance mode when using the Utopias. So they're both headphones I would highly recommend. Two others that I happened to try were the Hi-Fiman Ananda, which I've got here for a future review, and it worked beautifully with the Euterpe on low impedance mode as well. And finally the HD 560S, which I've also got coming up for review, worked wonderfully in the high output impedance mode setting. Or both, but I used it on high output impedance mode because you've got a higher impedance from the 560S. Once again, the higher output impedance brings a little bit of extra body and warmth to the 560S like it does with the Utopias, and at the expense of maybe just a tiny little bit of detail and resolution, but not too much. It's certainly extremely enjoyable and still very resolving, and you can always switch back to low impedance mode should you want the absolute truth from the sound. Testing it with the 560S also gave me a good sense of how it's going to perform across any of the higher impedance Sennheiser and Beyerdynamic range, and I did run it quite a few times with the HD 800S while I had it, and it was equally as good with the HD 800S, once again with my preference being for the high output impedance mode for that extra bit of warmth and body. So now while we're still talking the sound of the Euterpe on its own, let's talk tubes. In my experience hunting around for different tubes, the PL95s that it comes with are not the easiest tube to pick up. There don't seem to be a lot of new manufacturing tubes being made, and so it's a matter of finding new old stock or NOS tubes on places like eBay and the like. There are plenty around, they pop up regularly, so there's no sense of a shortage of tubes, but they're not a super common tube like some of the other options around the market. The middle tube, the 12AT7, that's a different story. You can buy those easily and everywhere quite simply, whether they're new old stock or they're brand new production units. For this review, I just tried a couple of tube rolling options, the first being a set of Tungsram PL95s, which are the two outside tubes. They're a new old stock version, so an old production model, and they brought a nice bit of extra warmth and body to the music. And that's one of the beauties of tube amps, is you can very quickly and easily tweak the sound quality just by changing tubes. That means you can try a few different options, settle on what you really like, or change it when you know you're after a different sound from the amplifier. For the record, I don't think there's any need to tube roll with the Euterpe because it sounds fantastic straight out of the box. But should you want to do some tube rolling, the Tungsram PL95s are a really nice option if you can pick a pair up. What I found in hunting for PL95s online is they're not a high priced tube, and that's great. You can afford to buy a whole lot of different options and see what you like the most. There is also a switch on the top of the Euterpe at the back for changing between PL95 and EL95 tubes. Now in theory they're both essentially the same type of tube that just run at different voltages, so you do need to make sure you have that switch in the right position or you might accidentally kill your PL95s, but if you have it in the right position, the theory is you won't get vastly different sound out of the two types of tubes, but it might give you more variations in tube rolling for those subtle colorations that you can get. I haven't tried any EL95 tubes in the Euterpe, as I was finding it much easier to source PL95 tubes than the EL95 counterpart. While we're still talking tubes, let's talk about the central tube, which is a 12AT7. The 12AT7 comes from the same family as the 12AU7 and the 12AX7, and that's a really good thing to know, because you can roll 12AU7s and 12AT7s quite comfortably through the Euterpe. I don't believe the 12AX7 works quite the same way, but you'd need to check that to be sure. What I do know about the 12AU7 is it has a lower gain output than the 12AT7. So it's a really nice choice to put in that central slot if you just want a little bit less gain out of the Euterpe and therefore slightly more usable volume range. That's actually how I've used it most of the time, because I do like a little bit more range on the volume pot. In my tube rolling options, I had a Genelex Gold Lion and also a NOS RCA Clear Top 12AU7 that I tried in the Euterpe. The stock JJ tube was fine, it's a new production tube and it does an okay job, but I found with the Clear Top I got a slightly more extended treble with a bit more sense of clarity up top, not necessarily better, just different. And with the Genelex Gold Lion, I found I got just a slight improvement in resolution, but it was very, very minor and not something I think is a huge upgrade and not something to worry about too much. For me, I stuck with the Genelex Gold Lion as my personal preference out of the tubes I tried. I think for me, if you do get the Euterpe, it is worth picking up a few NOS tubes to see what you like, but you're not going to find it transforming drastically like some other amps do, and straight out of the box, it's already fantastic. All of the impressions I told you before were in the stock setup, so it's absolutely magical even if you never roll a tube in your life. So at this point, it's time to put the Euterpe into context. I often talk about my Bottlehead Mainline. It's consistently been an outstanding performer no matter what I've put it up against, and so far has only really been beaten in definitive sound quality by the Hugo TT2 amplifier. The Mainline retails as a kit for $1,299 US, making it $400 cheaper than the Euterpe. However, my Mainline has been upgraded with some capacitors, so the price difference is probably not quite that big anymore. It's probably closer to $200 difference. So for $200 more, you get a pre-built, beautifully designed amplifier, or for $200 less, you can buy yourself a kit and make it yourself. As for the sound quality you'll get out of both, I find both of them to be absolutely exceptional. I think I'd describe them as pretty much on par overall, but they are different. So with the Euterpe, you're getting that beautiful euphonic, and maybe euphonic's the wrong word because that might suggest that it's warm, but you're getting that beautiful magical timbral quality through the mid-range, which the Mainline doesn't have. So the Mainline stays a bit more neutral, maybe a touch dry in comparison to the very liquid mids from the Euterpe, but both are exceptional and highly enjoyable. The soundstage from both is very similar, and I think the only places that I can really split the two of them is that the Mainline is probably just a tiny bit more resolving, and that may come down to the slightly drier, more neutral sound, and it also has better bass extension, and that's something that I'm finding over and over again is very much the party piece of the Mainline. Many tube amps have quite a significant roll-off in the bass and don't produce those really lower octave bass notes that these solid-state amps can do. In the case of the Euterpe, that holds true. There is a little bit of bass roll-off, which is pretty common for tube amps, but the Mainline doesn't have that problem. So if you're into your deep, hard-hitting bass, you'd actually want to go the Mainline definitely. But if you're just looking for musical enjoyment, I think both of them are fantastic. The Mainline doesn't really offer you any tube rolling options because the tubes used in it are pretty consistent no matter which ones you get, and so it's probably going to come down to whether you like the look and the finished product of the Euterpe, plus maybe the option to roll tubes, versus the do-it-yourself kit design of the Mainline and the ability to do some upgrades. I personally would be very, very happy with either, and in my case, if I'm going to keep one, it's going to be the Mainline because I put my own effort and love and care into building it, and that's the only reason I'd choose it over the Euterpe. Otherwise, it would be an absolute coin toss. So to sum this all up, if you're in the market for a gorgeous, amazing sounding tube amplifier, you should absolutely look at the Euterpe. As I said before, don't think of it as an amplifier and a DAC, think of it as an amplifier with a backup DAC sitting in there. It's all about the amplification in my mind, and it does a spectacular job in that regard. It's a beautiful, beautiful amplifier that deserves to be listened to and is going to suit almost every headphone you can think of, particularly the higher end headphones. If you happen to have the Mesa Empyreans and are looking for a perfect match, look no further than this guy. It is absolutely insane. That combination is just magical to my ears. It's certainly not a cheap amplifier at $1,700 but at the same time, I do believe you're getting your money's worth, and it stacks up really well against anything else I've heard to date, including more expensive amps like the Denafrips Artemis and even the amplifier in the TT2. It's not as good as the amplifier in the TT2 in terms of sheer transparency, bass extension and overall resolution, but in terms of pure enjoyment, it's absolutely up there and an easy recommendation from me. So if you want to know more, I'll put a link down below through to the Auris Audio website, and from there you can check out your local dealers and pick one up from someone near you. As always, I hope you found this review useful. If you have, please hit the subscribe button and the like button to help me bring more videos like this to you and others like you. In the meantime though, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.